Hello, and welcome to this lecture on Sex, History, and Art, the Greeks. I'm Tony Anadio. In our course, there are 4 modules. In each, there'll be a video lecture by me. They won't be very fancy. It'll just be me talking in front of a bunch of books. Additionally, you will have a number of websites to visit, articles to read, PDF and Word format. And if I find some other video lectures, I may include them as well. And there was a suggested book title. You weren't required to get it if you want to. You're more than welcome. But you can really use any source that you find useful. Whatever works is okay with me. I will say, however, that there's a lot of material I've provided for the course. Way more than you need. So my suggestion to you is to do your reading efficiently. And the best way to do that is to have the questions in mind. There are discussion topic questions in each of the modules, and then you have the essays. So make sure you know what you're looking for when you do all that reading. What I'm trying to do is to recreate what historians do. What we do in our research is we go to archives and there's tons and tons of stuff. We read books and look at all kinds of artifacts and so on. There's a lot of stuff and it's not always useful. So what we have to do is to try and figure out what we need and what we don't need. And in a sense, that's what you will have to do with your readings. There's a lot of stuff there. You don't need it all. So try to figure out what you need, what you don't need, and it's not going to be perfect. Sometimes you're going to have to go back and reread something, or you will have taken notes on something and then realize, oh, I didn't need this at all. Historians, when they look at history, they take all of that evidence and then they write stuff, their interpretation of that evidence. And they don't always get it right. And I will not hold you to a higher standard than the discipline itself. So what I want you to do is to look at that material and offer your interpretation of it. And don't be afraid to take chances. What I don't want you to do is just simply to report what happened. The same goes for the discussion topics. You'll have to take the topic and try to answer how, why, what does this mean, why is this important. In your response posts, what you should be doing is looking at the initial posts of other students, and you can either disagree with them, offer some reasons why, some examples, and so on, or you can take one of their points and elaborate on it, or you can add something else to their post. You also have the essay questions, and as I said, you want to make sure that you keep the topics in mind, but you'll also have as much access to me as you need. So if you get stuck on something, just call me, email me, or what have you, and we'll work through it. So I must begin by offering a little word of caution. This is a very controversial topic, sex is. So we have to be careful in how we approach it, how we deal with other students. We want to make sure that we're historical. The reason for that controversy is an essential component of our course. I mean, this isn't unique to our period of time. This has always existed. So what we want to try to understand is, how and why those things happened in the past. But as we do that, we have to be mindful. And I can't really tell you where that line is. It's sort of like that old joke about pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. So just, be cautious, not too cautious. I mean, I don't want you to, withhold your interpretation. But, just try to be adult about it. If somebody steps over a line, then I will probably say something, or maybe somebody else will, or whatever. But we really should keep this in the spirit of intellectual discovery. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish here. Because sex is really one of the most deeply personal aspects of being human. It's one of the most complicated, one of the most intellectual and emotional. It's one that is not fully understood. In our course, the role of art will be key to understanding. If we think about our senses, in particular sight, sound, feeling, that's really how we apprehend reality, and very often that's how we first experience art. Our senses are our initial contact. And then our brains process that information, and then there's some emotional response. For things that are very intense or fall into certain categories, sometimes we call them sensual. And sometimes that can mean sexual. What art does for us is that it immediately sums something up. In other words, we can see it immediately, even though it may be complex and there's hidden meanings and things like that, but generally it's an immediate response. Art is a recreation of reality based upon the artist's values. Now, the written word is valuable as well, and that has evolved over many, many thousands of years, although the earliest forms of written language were pictograms. They were pictures. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So we're going to at least take that into consideration. But sometimes, sex requires information that is conveyed visually. And so we're going to look at how that forms part of the historical narrative. And sex is a necessity of survival. It's a source of great pleasure and pain, both physical and mental. So what we want to do is look at these intersections. When we look at, the period of time prior to the Greeks, we don't really know when people made the connection between coitus and childbearing. We assume at some point they did. But then you have this notion of birth, and for animals that would be understood, and of course human beings are animals, but human beings have a different understanding of this. In other words, we have ways of thinking about it. So when a person is born, that person also has a soul. And that makes things a little more complicated made things more complicated for early humans to understand. And of course, there's a connection to death as well. So as early people tried to understand their world, their own personal lives as well as the world that they live in, it's not a stretch that in order to explain creation, they use these things we call creation myths, and in some cases are very similar to the act of procreation. The one notable exception is the Judeo-Christian tradition. In that story, God created the universe, the earth, and Adam. He's generally referred to as a he. So this is kind of an all-male event. And then he creates woman from Adam's rib. And then there's the notion of original sin, which always blame the woman as the story goes. And so this whole story of the Bible, original sin, and this creation myth, it's told in a way to explain that women would now give birth in sorrow and men would be their master. Men tend to be physically stronger than women, so that gave them an advantage. But in the narrative, there's really no way to falsify it. There's no way to check the story. There's no evidence. So it's very hard to argue against it, especially if those who are promoting the story happen to have more physical force. It's a lot more complicated than that, but in this video lecture I don't want to take 8 hours to tell you the story, so I'll be a little I'll overgeneralize. But with the Judeo-Christian, eventually Christian tradition, you have notions of circumcision and arranged marriages and dowries and laws associated with marriage. And other cultures are similar, although not all of them had circumcision. This is the world before the Greeks. But the Greeks were well aware of the world around them. People will trade as far as they can travel, and the Greeks were no exception. When people trade with other cultures, they import more than just merchandise. They import cultural values, and especially if the merchandise that they're purchasing is somehow related to art, because art represents the artist's values, and so that gets imported into a culture as well. So the Greeks, one of the things that separates them is how they study the natural world. In particular with mathematics, they look at this geometrically. And they start to understand that there are these mathematical relationships, these ratios. And they refer to one of them as the golden ratio, roughly 1 to 1.6. And they also notice that the human body largely fits this ratio. And they began to use this to define beauty. And when we think of Greeks and beauty, we tend to think of the sculptures and the pottery and so on. But if there's a symbol of Greek beauty, it's a woman named Helen, who was the daughter of Zeus and Leda. She was married to the king of Sparta, Menelaus. But in a related story, a young man named Paris, who was the son of the king of Troy, Priam, was asked to judge who was the most beautiful woman in the universe. It was Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And of course, each one of them wanted to be chosen. This is often referred to as the judgment of Paris. Hera promises Europe and Asia if Paris will pick her. Athena promises great skill in battle. And Aphrodite promises Helen, this unbelievably beautiful woman who was married. Well, that's who he chose. And so he takes Helen back to Troy, and of course this is what leads to the Trojan War as written down by Homer in the Iliad. The face that launched 1,000 ships. So the Greeks are using this narrative to explain aspects of their real world. And the Greek gods are examples of that. So for example, you have Zeus. And his creation story is tied to the creations of other gods. You have Mother Earth, Gaia, who has sex with her brother, the sky god Uranus. Their children are the Titans, Cyclops, and other monsters. Their oldest child is named Kronos. He marries his sister Rhea and doesn't want to be challenged for his power, so he eats all of his children. Then Rhea is pregnant again, and she doesn't want Kronos to eat this child, so she hides in a cave on Mount Ida on the island of Crete. She gives birth to Zeus. And then when he comes to eat the child, she gives him a stone and swaddling cloth. He eats it, makes him sick, he throws up all the other children. And then he decides to cut the wing off of his father, Uranus, so that he doesn't have any more children. And he throws it into the ocean, and then from the sea spume, Aphrodite is born. So there's all of these, creation myths around the Greek gods. But for the Greeks, their gods were a lot like them, except that they had these superpowers. But they also had human foibles. The Greeks used these to explain their own sexuality. And one of the places that we can see this sexuality existing is in something known as the symposia. In a symposium. This is where men would get together and drink and eat and discuss important things. But for the Greeks, the tradition involved homosexuality. But not really just homosexuality. We have another name for it. It's called pederasty. And the way this worked is that a young man in his 20s would select some young child in his teens and kind of woo him with gifts of, livestock like rabbits and cocks and so on and so forth. And sometimes the young man would play hard to get, and once he had won the young boy, then he would guide him into manhood, and then the two would often have sex. And then afterward, the relationship would end, and the young boy would marry, and then, of course, do the same thing himself. In Athens in particular, the role of women is complicated. They have virtually no public life. Even in their homes, the homes are divided. And this kind of echoes the way they saw the soul. They saw the superior section of the soul as male and the inferior section as female. And so the houses as well are divided. But pederasty was also a form of education. It was a way to teach someone not just the basics of knowledge, but also cultural knowledge, how to exist in society. The sex that they would have, and you'll see quite a bit of it on the PowerPoint, but one type of sex that was frowned upon was anal sex, because anal sex meant that the person was in a state of submission, which the Greeks did not approve of. So the way that they would have sex, apart from oral sex, was known as intercrural sex. So the young boy would squeeze his thighs together, and the older gentleman would have sex with him that way, without anal penetration. Anal sex was often something that you would see with prostitutes, and there were lots of prostitutes. With the Greeks, there were examples of men who were homosexual, but most of them were bisexual. They were mostly married, they had children, they would have sex with their slaves and prostitutes, etc. And so having anal sex with a prostitute was okay because that woman was necessarily in submission. In one particular case, a prostitute, or hetera, as sometimes they're called, named Phryne, or Phryne, depending on your pronunciation, had been brought to trial. She'd been the lover of a famous sculptor named Praxiteles. She was being defended by Hyperides. And in the court, he's arguing, and it's not going very well. And so eventually he tries a different tack. He pulls off her cloak and reveals her perfect breasts, and she's acquitted. You might think, gee, officer, do you have to give me a ticket? She wasn't on trial for a speeding ticket. She was on trial for profanity, which is very interesting because the defense is essentially, what man could resist this? And so she was found not guilty. It's a complicated story, and there's a lot of different ways that you can look at it. I simply relate it to you here. But when we look at something like that, nudity, we can, even today, we could show a statue, a sculpture of a female nude, but in public, but, for a woman to just suddenly take off her top, that would probably result in an arrest. So, these tensions, exist throughout time, and, we can sometimes, realize that things haven't changed very much, even, the more that they do change. With the Greeks and their sort of mythologies. You have explanations for a lot of things. The Greek gods were notorious philanderers. They were always cheating on each other, which, reflected Greek society itself. And there were some very unusual aspects of sex. For example, the god Hermes and Aphrodite had a child, Hermaphroditus. The nymph Salamacus wanted him, desired him, and appealed to the gods to bind her body with his. And so we have a body that is both male and female, which we call a hermaphrodite after this story. But there are other versions of this story, too, that humanity started out as this third sex, and these male-female creatures eventually attacked the gods, and Zeus decided to split them into two. And those males who sort of identified with the hermaphroditic part of that entity would seek out women, and same for women. And then those who identified with the same sex were homosexuals, as a way to sort of explain that behavior. There's the story of the king of Cyprus, Cinyras, whose daughter Myrrha was in love with him, and she tricked him into sleeping with her. And then when he finds out, he's mad with rage, and she has to flee, and she seeks the aid of Zeus, who turns her into a tree that now bears her name, Myrrh. 10 months later, the tree splits, and out pops Adonis, who was desired by both Aphrodite and Persephone, and they both pursue him. Zeus rules that each of them should have him for 6 months, but Aphrodite is married to Ares, and in a fit of rage, he disguises himself as a boar and kills Adonis. So all of these stories are about these Greek gods, could just as well be about regular people in terms of this sort of jealousy and so on. Greek women in Athens and Sparta were very, very different. I mean, in Athens, Greek women have very, very little public role. They have virtually no rights whatsoever. In Sparta, it was a bit different. The women had a lot more freedom. But there's also a great deal of female sex as well, the most famous being the poetess Sappho of Lesbos. So I want to read one of her poems to you. It's written to a young woman whom she was attracted to. Your magical laughter, this I swear, batters my heart, my breast astir. My voice, when I see you suddenly near, refuses to come. My tongue breaks up, and a delicious fire runs through my flesh. I see not a thing with my eyes, and all that I hear in my ears is a hum. The juices run down, a shuddering takes me in every part, and pale as the drying grasses then, I think I am near the moment of dying. I mean, it seems here as if she is almost describing an orgasm. Not too much of her poetry has survived, but there is plenty of artistic evidence to, suggest, not as much as there is for men, but to show that, women, frequently had sex with each other, and there were entire cults that were sort of devoted to this, where, there'd be these religious celebrations and so on. So when we look at the history of some of this stuff, and when you look at the art in the PowerPoints, it's pretty graphic, and we have to understand that, this pottery wasn't just local to the Greeks. I mean, this was a sort of trade item, these drinking cups and so on. And of course, they had lots of meanings for those who used them. But as this exports to other cultures, we'll see at least later how the Romans also adopt some of these practices. An interesting connection here, though, is one with music. And you'll see in a couple of those images, you'll see somebody playing what's known as a lyre, L-Y-R-E. The lyre was initially created by Hermes and presented to Apollo, who's the god of music. It is essentially gut, which is probably sheep intestines, strung on these kind of arms that come out of a tortoise shell. And as they are plucked, the tortoise shell resonates and acts as a sort of air pump, and it makes it a little louder. Apollo's son was Pan, and we know Pan as this kind of half man, half beast. He had the ears and legs of a goat, and he was known for his sexual insatiability. And he's pursuing a nymph known as Syrinx, and she throws herself into a river and is turned into a bed of reeds. And it is from these reeds that he fashions the pipes that bear his name. So you can see that, the Greeks are always using, the gods and sex to explain the things that exist in their day-to-day lives. And it's not unusual for them to do that. It's not unusual for any culture to do that. So what we want to try to do is to look at that evidence. Look at the stories, look at the pictures, and so on, and the general history, and then try to understand how that fits into this course, because you have to answer the questions. So what I would suggest is that you do the reading, you take the notes, and then if you get stuck on trying to explain these connections, then let me know, and we can talk about them. I will probably put up a couple of other videos that deal with the general history as well. But as I mentioned, each one of the modules will have a video lecture by me that will cover the particular topic. So we're going to look at the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance. Thanks for listening.